side. And I'm sorry, I just got an announcement there. Okay. The Campaign for Family Friendly Economy started in 2015. We actually started as a project to elevate the issues of family economics in the presidential primary in New Hampshire that year. If you recall, there was sort of a competitive primary on both sides of the political divide. And we really wanted to inject into the conversation issues like paid family and medical leave, childcare, livable wages, paid sick days, so that, the candidates, when they came to New Hampshire and were having really, small room conversations, were talking about those kitchen table issues with people. When we decided, through all the work that we did, connecting with folks throughout the state, that there was a real need and appetite for a campaign to continue to focus on those issues to make some progress. And so, we invested and did a bunch of fundraising to be able to build that into an ongoing campaign. So we're now in our 6th year. And I think starting to see the fruits of that, where as I'll get to, some of the biggest conversations going on with federal policy now are about childcare, paid family leave, family economics. And so it's a real ripening of some of those conversations, which is really exciting to see for New Hampshire and American families. So what Mary asked me to talk about were a couple of things: the sort of status for New Hampshire families, including the need for affordable childcare. So I'm going to start there. Policies that can make a big impact and what people can do. So I'm going to probably move a little fast. I apologize for that, but just ask questions afterward if you have anything in particular, and you can always follow up with me, and I will put my contact info in the chat afterward as well. So the basics, like all of these issues come to a head because families are really struggling to make ends meet. And pre-pandemic, the numbers from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston were that 40% of Americans couldn't afford an unexpected $400 expense. And you really saw this in the very earliest days of the pandemic when, basically the country shut down, and a week later you had mile-long lines at the food pantries, with people waiting to get basic provisions, because a week into the pandemic, a week into not having income, people were not able to feed themselves. And so, that really underscores that the actual impact of having so many families, 40% of American families unable to afford an unexpected $400 expense. And I did want to share my screen for 1 minute, if that's possible.
Yep, you should be able to.
Okay, I'm going to try that right now. Because this is some data from, can folks see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is some data from the Economic Policy Institute that shows what the monthly costs are for a family. And this is specific for Rockingham County. So this is a lot of data, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but, and you can see these are really, this is a thin budget. I know the speaker after me is going to talk about housing. I'm pretty sure he's going to tell you that housing is not $1,200 in Rockingham County, but this is what the budget that if you look at all the indicators, this is a bare bones family budget for Rockingham County. And what it shows you is that, one, childcare is very expensive for families with young children. It has largely eclipsed housing as a major, if not the major, driver in family budgets. It also shows you that for a family with 2 adults and 2 children, the annual income that family needs to make ends meet, just bare bones. And this doesn't include any money for savings, any student loan payments, any retirement, any fun. This is a bare bones budget. The annual total that you need in Rockingham County is $85,000, $876, in order to just get by. And you'll see in the farthest column, I also pulled it for 1 adult and 2 children. So for a single family, one person needs to make $76,000 just to make their basic basic ends meet in Rockingham County. So this is what, the reason I wanted to start here is because this is why there's so much conversation about families' economic struggle, is because even if you have a decent job, the median income in the state is $55,000. If you have a decent job, and for instance, you're a single parent with 2 kids, you are barely, if not at all, able to make ends meet. So I'm going to take out the screen sharing, but where you can find this is the Economic Policy Institute website. Let's see, how do I stop share? There we go. Okay, so like I said, it's a lot of data, but so one of the biggest drivers in family budgets is childcare. In the area, in Hampton, I've done a few in-district meetings with the childcare centers in the area, and there are some major things that they'll talk about in every conversation I've had with them. There is a absence of, there's not enough spots for the kids in the area. Makes for a lot of competition, especially for newborn children. One of the anecdotes that a child care provider in the region around Hampton has told me is that they are often the first call that a person makes when they are pregnant, before telling their parents, before telling anybody else. They call around to find a child care facility because the wait list is over a year for most places in the Seacoast. And so the first thing they need to do is call around and try to find a space as soon as they find out they're pregnant. And the rates are really, going up, and the pandemic didn't help because a lot of childcare facilities have struggled to stay open and struggled to stay staffed. So they had a workforce shortage to begin with, and it's gotten only harder and harder to fill the spots for staffing they need to be able to staff up their centers. So there's a lot of drivers on childcare that make it a hard business and a hard part of our economy, because it's really, the centers are always in a push and pull between needing to raise rates to pay for their wages and other costs to run the center, but not being able to raise them too much because they can't overprice it. It's already so expensive for families. And so there's, this anecdote that is, or the saying that is, families can't afford to pay, workers can't afford to stay, there has to be another way. And one of the really exciting things that is out of, I think, many coming out of the Biden administration is they are really proposing another way with childcare. So with the American Families Plan, the Biden administration has proposed to do a few things. One is to cap the amount of childcare, the amount that any family would have to pay on childcare, to 7% of their annual income. So that means that, it would keep childcare affordable for every family. And the difference would be made up for the subsidy from the government. The families plan would also provide direct workforce support so that childcare centers could pay competitive wages so that they could compete with, not just right now, they're struggling to compete with what Dunkin' Donuts is paying. Like the average childcare worker salary has been $12 an hour in New Hampshire. It's more than that now for any of the fast food restaurants, so childcare centers are really struggling, as are any really any care facilities, long-term care, direct home care services are struggling just to compete with basic entry-level fast food wages at this point. And they can't just jack up rates because the economics around that for families. So the families plan would also invest in direct workforce support to centers so that they could offer competitive wages and be able to staff up. The families plan also addresses some of the other big family economic issues that are really important to families' bottom lines right now. We've all heard a lot, very appropriately, about healthcare insurance costs over the past many years, and we have a lot of work there still to do to make those affordable and reasonable for families. But the other side of healthcare costs is what happens when families experience an unexpected health emergency. So you both have a lot of cost from the care that you need, but families also lose a lot of income when they have a health challenge where they can't go to work, either for a few sick days or for a much longer period with time needed out of work because they are dealing with a family health crisis. So health costs, an unexpected health emergency is the single largest driver of families into poverty that there is. And that's why you've been hearing more and more about paid family and medical leave, because it would do what unemployment insurance does for people, which is provide a temporary financial bridge when people can't be at work and are out of and don't have income. So 2/3 of people in New Hampshire right now do not have paid family and medical leave insurance. Despite what the governor says right now, he did not he did not change that. He recently, there was a piece of policy in the very bad state budget that was recently passed that he is, proclaiming as paid family leave. If you're interested in more details, there's an op-ed from me actually in today's Concord Monitor, sort of talking about some of the problems with that. It is not paid leave. People will still be waking up, 2 years from now saying, I have this very same problem of not having paid leave when I need it, all across the state. But in the American Families Plan that President Biden has proposed, he's proposed, in addition to those childcare supports that I mentioned, a national paid family and medical leave program, and a number of other really great benefits that would really change the game for families' economic security and be really important. Our senators and members of Congress are very supportive of all of these policies. And so in the category of what can you do, it is to contact them and say you support those policies. So both in the American Rescue Plan that has already been passed, our entire congressional delegation supported that. Our governor said that if he were in the Senate, he would not have supported that. He's enjoying spending the money, so he talks it up a lot when he spends the money coming from the federal government, but he had said that he would not have supported the American Rescue Plan. One of the other things that is really important in the American Rescue Plan right now is that families started getting an expanded child tax credit as of July 15th. They got their first payment. The next one will come August 15th through the rest of the year. And for families, that's about $300 per kid that they're getting in their bank account each month as an additional, it's an expanded credit against their taxes. And it's making a huge difference for families' economic security. So right now, what you can do, we can thank our congressional delegation for their votes in support of that. Tell them we support the caregiving economic policies in the American Families Plan. And then the other things that I would say we can do are to share, if you have caregiving stories, if you have either raised children and experienced the financial ramifications of that, if you are caring for elderly family members or have a family member who needs long-term care, we need to be sharing those stories both with our members of our delegation so that they can lift those up and give them as examples, say, they're always sharing these, so they will be on the floor of Congress saying, I just talked to somebody in my district who told me about her experience caring for her elderly mother without paid leave, and then, has something to share and to hark back on. In fact, Senator Hassan just released the Care Can't Wait campaign just released last week, a really excellent video that I would encourage you all to check out. That is an interview with actually Chris, somebody who used to work with you, Audrey Gerken, and Senator Hassan about the challenges that caregiving has for our workforce, the ability for people to stay in the workforce, and the economic ramifications for all of that. So we need people to share their caregiving stories. So if you have a caregiving story that you'd like to share, you can contact me. We're releasing a monthly storybook of stories of New Hampshire families with caregiving economic related stories, so that allows us to both get those stories into the media to be case making stories that make the case for these policies. And they also allow our delegation to be able to have examples to back up why they are supporting these policies. And then just one more thing that I would say is that we also really need to share the experience of businesses and care providers and others speaking out in support of these kind of policies. And so if you have connections to either, caregiving, home caregivers, direct support professionals, businesses that are supportive, we really need to lift up those voices again so that we can help our delegation make the case for these policies and get them prioritized in the budget reconciliation package they'll be dealing with very soon. So thank you. I know that was a lot. I really appreciate the time, and we'll take a couple of questions.
Amanda, this is Chris. Can you talk a little bit about what we can and quite frankly should be doing at the state level to help families, particularly with the childcare issue?
Yes. If not surprisingly, to many of you on this, to any of you on this meeting, we are headed in the wrong direction with this administration. Um, even with the year we've had, where families like mine, I have 3 school-aged kids, and spent the year plus with balancing them not being in person in school while having a full-time job. This has been a really challenging time for parents. At that same time, the governor cut $8 million out of our state budget for childcare scholarships for working families. It's kind of mind-boggling to see that kind of lack of investment in what families need. At the same time, there was a bill to change the way that it's a kind of a long, detailed process, but basically right now, when a family has a sick day, they get a child care scholarship, those sick days are not covered by the state. And so the family gets the double whammy of having to pay for child care tuition that they wouldn't otherwise have had to pay for a kid that was in school. And then oftentimes they aren't getting paid for the sick day that they have to take out of work to be home with that child. So the Republican majority in the legislature voted down a bill to cover those, the enrollment, not just the attendance of kids, which would have been a really big deal for working families. So there are a lot of these kind of policies that ways that we could make a real difference that right now we're failing to because of the leadership in the state.
Okay. Other questions for Amanda before she, takes in the ball game?
Catherine.
Hi, thanks, Amanda. I wanted to ask, even before COVID, we had difficulty with working parents because of a lack of pre-K in New Hampshire, and that was a big part of the conversation. So it sounds like the rescue plan is trying to find ways to help get people to work, and pre-K is one of them. These incentives or others. Do you have any data on how many working moms are there in the workforce, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, and vis-a-vis other states, just to see how do New Hampshire mothers or parents, I should say, fare in terms of their ability to work?
Yes, there is actually a lot of data about this, and I can't rattle off the numbers off the top of my head from my car.
Sure.
But yes, this is the largest group of people who are people who would be ready and able to be part of our workforce, but cannot be right now, are caregivers, because they are out of the workforce because they can't find care for whether it's a child or an adult family member that needs assistance. They can't find it or they can't afford it. And so the workforce shortage is basically, you hear about it everywhere you go, in every industry you work in. The biggest thing that we could do to help inject folks into our workforce is to meet the caregiving needs of people who are out of our workforce because of care responsibilities. And it is a big number. One of the most heartless things I think that was done this spring was the pulling back the federal money for unemployment insurance that was made available for people who were long-term on unemployment because of COVID. And the reason I think that a lot of the conversation about that was that like the extra money was keeping people on unemployment insurance. It's not, but then they found out, now that we've been in now that was pulled back for a couple of months, the numbers didn't change of people that are not in the workforce or that are on unemployment. Remarkably, they stayed pretty consistent, and that is because the people who are out of work right now are out of work not because they are lazy and don't want to go to work. They know that there are jobs available. They can't get there because their kids aren't in childcare, their kids aren't in person school. They're worried about whether they will be in person in the fall. And so, and I know even, with my kids' school, they don't have the workforce they need for school buses. So they're talking about not being able to, have kids bus to school. And so all those things pile up on the ability of people with caregiving responsibilities to commit to and to get to work. And so we need to address some of those underlying issues that are keeping people out of our workforce, and caregiving is a huge piece.
I think one of the key items, and Amanda alluded to it, is that in order to provide care, you've got to have caregiving staff. And the caregiving staff in New Hampshire, unfortunately, they don't make a lot of money. And it's not, unusual to see people who are providing, care to, people earning, 10, 12, dollars an hour. And even if they're making $15 an hour, it's not nearly enough. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens as employers are willing to pay more. How many of the people that want to do the caregiving just don't do it because they can't afford to? They've got to take the other jobs. I mean, I have thought this for a while, that the New Hampshire social safety net is, in serious jeopardy of just collapsing.
It is, and as you know, Chris, a lot of the long-term care support folks, the wages that places that provide those services are able to pay is often, managed by Medicaid reimbursements, and so there's only so much that facilities can often pay people and stay within those guidelines. And so one of the other things that is being looked at through the budget reconciliation process that's related to caregiving is to increase those rates and increase the amount of direct support to care professionals for home and community-based services, because they are unable to compete and keep people in the workforce.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm sure that the first pitch has already been thrown, Amanda, so we should let you get into the ballpark.
Thank you so much for having me. And by the way, I just want to say I was really impressed by the digital stuff up at the beginning, and would love to follow up with you, Erica, about how you've made that happen, because it's incredibly sophisticated, and I'm just really impressed.
Well, since you were impressed, I just want the record to show that it was my idea.
Well, well, thanks everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you,
Thank
Amanda.
you, Amanda.
Go fish your cat.
Thanks.
George, it's all yours.
Yes, great. Well, great to be here. And I echo what Amanda said about that campaign, the video. It's really, really compelling. And certainly in our work in advocacy, we're always trying to find a million ways to sort of move the understanding and activism around affordable housing. And we too, really want to make sure we can relay, and we meaning a very large group of people around the state, to relay the personal message about how this is affecting people. And I often talk about caregivers because, even right here in Dover, where I live, Durham has Harmony Homes, and the owner is trying to build 44 cottage homes in Dover. And I hear so much pushback, and I get it, maybe there'll be more traffic, but he's trying to solve an employee problem. And so affordable housing is a huge issue for all of us that are experiencing it, for people that we know, but certainly for the employers, has been said. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm mindful that we don't have a lot of time. And so maybe the best thing that will happen is that I can leave these with Mary to follow on later on, and that you can look at. But I'm going to go through some of these things. But first, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about New Hampshire Housing. By the way, the two pictures there, that's where things all happen. We really believe that trying to change the regulatory environment starts with people and their voting right at their town meeting, or through the representative if they've got a city council form of government. But a bit about us, in case you're not familiar with who we are. New Hampshire Housing was established in 1981. We're not a state agency. We're a self-sustaining public corporation. The connection back to the state is we do have a 9-member board of directors that's appointed by the governor and the council. And really what we're trying to do is promote and finance and support affordable housing in New Hampshire, and really help how to create housing that's affordable to low and moderate income households, but also how we can support the real estate industry as well as the economy in general. So that's just a bit about us, and I'll proceed forward. As Mary said, she wanted me to talk about some of the history. I'm not going to go way back to redlining and the GI Bill, and obviously our traveling with the invention of the automobile, moving out into the suburbs. But I do want to talk a bit about what many of us might remember the 80s, where there was a bunch of building boom. Our population was growing, lots of young people. And And as we were going into the 2000s, we or getting near the end of 1999, we asked Russ Tebow, who is someone who does a lot of economic research, to kind of look at the impact of a constrained housing supply on economic development. And so as we looked at that, as I mentioned, there was strong expansion of housing, of the economy, as well as housing, which was in the form of all the surplus housing that had been built in the 80s. We had a lot of job growth. And as people came into the state, which is where we got most of our workforce, they started eating up all those homes that at one point had been surplus. And during that whole time period of the 90s, a lot of growth control measures. So single family housing production really slowed down, and multifamily apartments really slowed down even more so. Didn't really know it because there was such a surplus from the 80s. But now we kind of fast forward, and what's happening in the last decade and more. Well, our housing challenge is we have an aging population. So before, the issue was our schools are busting at the seams. Now we have fewer kids being born. We've got a population that is then naturally sort of aging. We do have some people that are coming in that are younger, and that's been kind of a recent development, not so much COVID related, but just in the last few years. But what that presents in terms of our housing challenge is we've got younger people, and we were just talking about childcare, but young people that have decent jobs, that have a debt load from school, from their college loans and things. We've got older adults that are looking at their community and saying, you know, where can I go? And maybe if I can't, maybe I'm just going to fix up my house, or maybe I can find a place in my community. And that has impacts. And essentially, though, if they can, a lot of folks are saying, well, you know, in New Hampshire, we've got a lot of 4 and 5 bedroom homes with 1 and 2 people in them. And so as they look to downsize, you know, surprise, surprise, a lot of folks are looking for the same homes that younger people are looking for, those starter homes or ranch style homes. And so that's really, you know, created this mismatch of housing stock, big homes that maybe people don't want to live in. They may be too expensive for people who are just trying to start out to live in. Families aren't necessarily as big, like I was mentioning as before, or that happens much later. So when I'm talking to people and talking to communities, I'm sort of saying or asking them in their community, because that's where a lot of things change can happen, is what are the housing options that you have now in your community? And who are the people that you think you're missing? We just talked about caregivers. You know, they've got to live somewhere nearby. And then look and say, you know, what do we allow and incentivize through our land use regulations, and therefore by corollary, what do we not allow, and trying to dig into some of those reasons. And some of those are based on some myths and misperceptions that need to continually be explored. And I think a lot of folks think, you know, it's a market will take care of itself. I'm here to tell you that the housing market is heavily regulated by what I just talked about. So it's not just supply and demand. There's real costs of lumber, the cost and the even availability of labor, because after the housing market sort of crashed, a lot of that talent went away. And then in our towns, certainly some local resistance to housing development. It's interesting, and I've got a slide at the end, but you know, there's certainly kind of widespread understanding and embracing the fact that we've got a real housing shortage. But when it comes to saying, what are we going to change in my community, or more importantly, how's the lot next door to me going to be changed, it becomes much more real. And that's where it's important to have really meaningful human conversations at the local level to balance the need for housing, its relationship to the economy in our region, community development, and on balance with how we pay for our municipal services and how we make sure that we're conserving our environment and making sure we don't just take over everything with the built environment. And I mentioned other factors, you know, certainly, like I mentioned, availability of labor, availability of land, and that's regulated by land use regulations as well. And certainly we've seen that the cost of materials has really been a real drain on just being able to build homes. And so if it can be built, the developer is going to naturally try to go where they can get the most profit. And that makes it even harder to build some of these more affordable homes. So what's missing, many of you might be familiar with slides like this, called missing middle housing. It's not the single family, it's not the big mid-rise that people tend to, and maybe rightfully so in rural communities, don't want to have a 48-unit building next to them. But what's the incremental approach? What about duplexes or triplexes, accessory dwelling units, that maybe we have kind of left by the wayside, that might be some of that incremental solution as we try to look at that supply problem that we have. Mary asked me to talk a little bit about, what's happening in the housing market now. So I've got a few slides. I want to go through these kind of quick, but we all know that the median, so that's the midpoint of housing prices, have been steadily going up. The yellow line are existing home sales. So we're looking at, existing home sales between $380,000, $400,000. And then the purple line, which is all over the place, there isn't, number one, it reflects that there aren't a lot of new homes that are being built. And those that are really, really expensive. So that's Hampton, but I also want to get a shot of the Portsmouth, Rochester area. So that's Hampton, Dover, Durham, all places in between. And we see that sort of steady increase after the housing bust of 2009. Or 2007 and 8, I should say. And we're up into again, with existing over 350,000 and then well over 400, maybe 475 for a new home. And the thing we all kind of know about is the inventory. We hear about it all the time. The yellow line are units that are under $300,000. There's a 2-month inventory. A 6 months inventory is kind of more of a balanced market. And then for homes that are above 300,000, about 3 months. So they're just being snatched up. And some of that is production oriented, but also people like me that live in the ranch that's 3 bedrooms and I've decided to renovate it because I'm not going to look for someplace else. So homes that don't ever make it on the market are a challenge. Here's what rent looks like. That also basically went up during all of COVID, certainly, but during our housing bust and during a recession. And that's gone up. So we've got, again, the yellow is 2 bedrooms. So that's pushing up to almost 1,900, and that's gross rent. So that's rent and utilities. Then the blue line are just all units, which is topping out right around 1,500. So when you think about that and affordability, the median income in this region is somewhere, for renters, is somewhere around 51,000. And the affordability is a challenge, people trying to make those rents and then take everything else that was just mentioned earlier for additional costs. And then the vacancy rate in Hampton, it's below 2% for both 2-bedroom and then all the units. And when you think about what a balanced market would be from the vacancy rate side on the rental, it's about 6%, 5-6%. When you're down around 2 or below, that's just really turnover. That's just someone leaving a unit and moving on. So I just want to quickly talk about some legislative advocacy that's happened. If you're familiar with the community revitalization tax relief incentive, it's something that the town can use to really help incentivize development. It was added to so that housing could be a component of it. It was part of House Bill 154 that passed in this legislative cycle to try to expand some of the benefits of how many years you can stay at that original tax level before it moves into being taxed at the fair market value. Just a couple of things, if you might recall, 2008 got the workforce housing law passed with a lot of partners, the Business and Industry Association, workforce housing coalitions around the state, a lot of folks. Accessory dwelling units was passed in 2017. That's for attached units. And a housing appeals board was happened, which helps to have an expedited appeals for housing related matters. And also trying to do the implementation of the Governor's Housing Task Force report, which came into some problem this year with House Bill, I think 586, just didn't make it. And that some of those recommendations were a part of that. So some of the things that we do in research and advocacy and technical assistance to help you in your communities, to help groups that are talking about housing, is to have robust studies. I think I saw in your link when you set up for this meeting that you had the link to our 2021 rental cost survey. So we update that every year. We've done numerous housing and school enrollment reports trying to tamp down the misperception that for every unit, there's 2 school children that are going to be there. I'm trying to talk about the economics of development. You know, we talk about developers in a bad light, and we've certainly got plenty of stories, but you know, there's a lot of risk that goes into their development, and it's important to have, I think, communities as they're looking at their land use regulations to understand the levers they can pull and how that translates to a developer's pro forma to actually get the housing that you're looking for. We just did complete a 10-year retrospective on the workforce housing law. It was passed in 2008, became active in 2010. And we do a lot of conferences. We've got an annual conference of housing and economy, but we also do smaller workshops and seminars. 2 years ago, we had Chuck Marone from Strong Towns. If you ever want to look at a website that has some really good information about housing and lots of things, and municipal revenue, Strong Towns is a great resource. Chuck Marone, who's in that picture, talked to us about the importance of doing the next simplest thing, incremental development, incrementally up and incrementally out. And we had Joe Manicosi this past year who did a study on land use regulations and its impact on value per acre, so where your revenue comes into town. So some of those coalitions that we work with, we've got a few around the state that are sort of formalized. In the Upper Valley Vital Communities, Monadnock Housing Roundtable. Here you may be more familiar with the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast and Sarah Reitzman. They all work to do grassroots advocacy, education, making and building relationships with people in communities, and really helping with that conversation. We support them. Some of the things here you'll see a charrette happening in the upper left, looking at a design of what something could look like. On the right there is a couple of years ago, a housing conference that was put on by the Workforce Housing Coalition. You've got a couple of planning directors at that conference, and Alyssa Margolin from Housing Action New Hampshire that's moderating. So we provide grants to those organizations, Housing Partner Program, startup funding for new housing coalitions, and then continued funding for existing ones. We've also got some education fund for volunteer planners and planning staff to get education that they might need that might be in-state or at a conference in Colorado. And then mini grants that we give for local groups to help them with their conversation and engagement around housing. A big thing is through Plan New Hampshire, we fund the Municipal Technical Assistance Grant Program. That's money up to about $25,000 per community to look at their housing, look at sort of their assessment of, you know, what are the barriers to the housing, compare your local regulations to your master plan, let's say, and try to get some good information for some good conversation in your community about the barriers and opportunities to housing. So some of the outcomes we've definitely seen over the years, an increased awareness of housing supply and affordability. That's, again, to talk about employers, they're really the ones really trumpeting a lot of that. Again, especially organizations that have assisted living and require caregivers, or hospitals that are really in trouble. We do have that enduring myth of school children, but we're able to talk about it, and I think people understand that it's not quite that way. And the impact of a constrained housing supply on really, you know, filling those jobs. We're seeing that in not just restaurants, but in all levels of hospitals, and really even, you know, executives that are being recruited sometimes look and say, you know, this is just not the kind of housing landscape I thought I would have, and we lose out on those people. There's definitely been increased activism and discussion of housing, groups like yours, other groups like New London Housing Commission, other communities really looking at their housing. So that's good. And I think that's an important way for people to come together and talk about their own housing trajectory, what it means in their community. And I think that's really encouraging. So what are some things to think about? I think this came out in a planning magazine, 3 zoning changes that make residential neighborhoods more affordable. One is, and this is happening in places throughout the United States, is eliminating single family only zoning. It's something that really, really constrains that opportunity for that missing middle housing I talked about. Embracing ADUs in the state, there's not a mandate for detached ADUs, but we live in a state where someone's garage could be retrofitted to have a detached accessory dwelling unit, or maybe they've got several acres of land and maybe a detached ADU would work, but in a lot of communities, it's just not allowed. And then in a lot of places, we still require parking minimums, and there's some reasons for that, but I think it needs to be addressed because that creates land, number one, that you don't get much revenue from. And secondly, it eats up a lot of land and it increases the cost of housing production. So in the Harmony Homes, the folks that I talked with, they were just happening to talk about it, were saying, it's going to be 2 cars for every one of those units. And, it's just not the way it is in reality. That's just not the way it is. We aren't certainly a completely walkable community because we're still driving places, but it's not, just like it's not always 2 school kids per unit, it's not always 2 cars per unit. So, and maybe this is a little encouraging. St. Anselm just did a recent study that finds there's support for affordable housing. I share with you again that I think a lot of that challenge is that while there is support, it's really challenged at the local level. I think it's important to keep doing legislative work at the state level, but even though we're not a home rule state, all communities I've talked with really value their sort of local control, real or perceived. And with that, I will end there, take questions. Let anything that I might have said, or if you have any questions or comments.
I guess I have, one comment, and that is that, and I saw this in my prior life where I was running a social services nonprofit, and we were based in Portsmouth. And I would say that probably 75% of our employees lived up in Stratford County because they couldn't afford living in Portsmouth. And I think that's the same issue that's happening in Hampton right now. A lot of businesses that are, particularly those businesses that are not paying as much as is necessary, are finding that the only people that are even remotely interested in working for them live 30, 40 miles away. And that creates a whole other dynamic, which is now you've got employees that are dependent on a car, and it adds an extra expense, and it's just a cycle that it's hard to get out of.
Yeah, it definitely is, and then you look at, okay, if they're living up in Stratford County, what is the housing options that are available there? And
right,
I've heard people in communities around Rochester area, they're saying, we don't need housing because we don't have any business in our area. We've got people that are feeding into the regional economy, right. And so yeah, absolutely. I see Rennie has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm someone who is very frustrated at the inability of the legislature to do anything in this area. We had that whole governor's task force recommendation, and quite frankly, it was the only bill that I think the governor expressed any interest in that I could find common ground with him this past session. But yeah, there are just forces who are just so opposed to that it's frustrating. The same people who gave us such a bad budget are the same people who oppose any efforts to try to deal with the housing crisis. And the other thing I just want to mention is that it's a couple of areas that I know, because we're lacking 20,000 housing units anyhow right away, it also impacts the area of mental health care, and it impacts the area of criminal justice reform, because it's the lack of any of the suitable housing to deal with those two populations that are create more problems and are actually impediments to dealing with our mental health care crisis and dealing with our criminal justice reform system. So
yeah.
Andy, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, Andy. You got to unmute.
Good.
There you go.
Okay, you all right?
Yep.
It looks like the moratorium on evictions may expire soon. And is there anything that New Hampshire can do about that?
Yeah, I know that's been asked, and I obviously from the federal perspective, nothing. I haven't heard any efforts to try to extend that moratorium from the state level side. Mm-hmm. I do know that certainly have the emergency rental assistance fund that still has a lot of money in it that we're still trying to get people out and apply for that. There's about 180, well, 200 million in general or overall. About 20 million went to Rockingham Community Action, or I'm sorry, the Rockingham County. And so impact about 3,000 renters, but I'm hoping that people just really move on that. And that, I think there was a thing, MUR, and my boss, Dean Christian, was interviewed along with New Hampshire Legal Assistance. His name's escaping me, but I think there he's just hoping that perhaps landlords will wait out knowing that assistance is there. But I don't know what's going to happen. I honestly don't.
George, we have a couple people, with us who are in town government. One person who's on our budget committee, another who's on our zoning board. Any words of, advice or suggestions to them?
Well, housing it's just one part of the community, right? So I would say, I would ask them if they've looked at their master plan, what it says about housing, and then take a hard look at their zoning, and with an eye towards getting feedback from trusted few developers to say, does what we have written going to get what we want? But I think the first question is what do you want? If a community doesn't want to have certain housing, it's hard to overcome that. But I do think that this is where grassroots conversation and engagement and making the story real. What if I lived in Hampton and I was a part of something, I might say, here's what I'm doing, or I'm trying to take care of my parents and they can't move here for whatever reason. Those things make stories real and relatable. And I think that's been lost as we crank up the volume and use, as much as we're a data-driven company, I think it's important to have real human conversations. But for the planning board, take a first look and say, what's our master plan saying? And let's take a look at our regulations and say, is it up to speed? A lot of regulations are retrospective and still on the books, reacting to that 1980s boom.
Okay, good. Barbara.
Yeah, hi, George. I think the need for awareness and what NEFA is doing to promote that it's really interesting, and it sheds a lot of light on the situation for communities. But is NEFA doing any direct underwriting or developing affordable housing units that can kind of fill in the gap?
We're exploring that. Our board has made a commitment of I think several $1 million to try to incentivize maybe small scale single family development, as well as working with Department of Transportation for some of their surplus land to see if we can get that and put some special funding into that, which might not necessarily be through the tax credit program, which is good as it is very rigid in what it can allow. So we're actively trying to explore that, and still exploring with the small scale development community as number one, trying to find out who those players are, but try to also continue to understand what might be helpful to them to incentivize development. Not so much incentivize, but they've got all this risk up front. Is there something that we might provide in terms of a surety, a guarantee, a bond, or something that reduces risk and allows capital to flow a little bit better, especially in the pre-development where we're not sure what's underneath the ground and all those other things. The other is really looking also to how do we, the ADU law was passed that sort of says you must allow attached ADUs in a residentially zoned area. But, for any of you or all of you that are homeowners, that money's got to come from somewhere. And if you're looking to make some return on that, it may take some years if you're doing it from an income perspective. And so we're looking at, what are ways to explore helping spur that development happen. And I think what is good about that is it's not a 40-unit apartment building. It's a small home on land that's already there. It's more that incremental development. So those are some things that we're really exploring. But mostly right now, we still got pretty robust single family home ownership programs and then our tax credit programs right now. Yes.
And just a follow-up, George. This may be kind of out of left field, but do you have any thoughts relating to the phenomena of tiny houses and whether that is something that communities should really consider, particularly when they're reviewing their zoning and requirements?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned about that. Number one, not everyone has the same understanding of what a tiny house might mean in terms of, and there's a definition, I think, in the International Residential Code, I think, of maybe 400 or 500 square feet. Some of them are on wheels or on a pad. I think the reason why it'd be good to explore it would simply be, I'd take it and say, how about small homes on small lots? What happened to that? And so I embrace the tiny homes for that idea. But I think it's worth exploring, but I think it's worth understanding what does that mean in terms of saying, let's not just go from, big house on 1 acre and then look at these tiny homes. How do we explore, why do we have minimum acreage in our towns? What is the rationale for that? And then secondly, why can't we just allow something to be built that's smaller on that? So I think that's a good start to explore. I really do. I don't know. I know there's some real questions about tiny homes on wheels, like how do you deal with septic and water and all those very important things, and that's important to consider. But along those lines, I'd like to consider, manufactured housing in general. That's often not allowed in subdivisions and communities. And as New Hampshire Community Loan Fund would tell you, it's one of the most affordable things to do. We offer in residential owned communities where it's the certified Fannie Mae secondary market financing. So you can finance your unit for like 4% as opposed to something that's a lot higher. So I think all those in this environment deserve to be looked at, especially with no matter what we do, that cost of lumber and materials these days is so high that it makes even a lot of incentive and subsidy really hard to produce.
Mike, did you have a question?
No, I wanted to make a comment though on the discussion that was one prior to the small housing. And that was how do you stimulate some of this building? And in the past, in the capital budget, occasionally there's been money put in to support, loans and funding. Just think it was two capital budgets ago, I think it was like $5 million was put in. So something in that range. So I think the capital budget, the development of that, just like the 10-year plan, usually starts about 2 years ahead. So you got to start working with the particular, and as far as the capital budget goes, the particular department that handles that, and try to get them to make it a recommendation that goes forward to the governor. So,
well, the good news on that is I think that's the Affordable Housing Fund you're talking about.
I think so.
And so the governor has been very active on that, and so is the legislature in getting annual appropriations on that, and 35 million went into it this year. And there's a carve out of the real estate transfer tax that's I think guaranteed to put in 5 million every year, and that's new in the last few years because that was really not well funded in years past. So that gives us some flexibility to further subsidize tax credit projects or any projects that are aimed at affordability. So I think that's a great point. Still, housing can be expensive as you try to translate that into a community that might have a lot of restrictions. There's one community that has a tax credit project in it that the road standards are so high that it's a really, really expensive proposition. There has to be 2 engineers on the site every second anything is happening with the road work. And so that takes some of that increased funding and it whittles it away because of some of these things that are happening locally. But the Affordable Housing Fund is a good win-win in the last few years. And
and before the governor jumped on it for one of his re-elections or whatever, it was struggling getting that money through. It was really hard. So
and a lot of partners, the Association of Realtors is a really strong group that got that through. I mean, that was important because that real estate transfer tax is something that they had to, I think, believe and understand and weigh in on.
All right.
Can I
George?
ask one quick question, Chris?
Sure. Yeah, go
All
ahead.
right, thanks, George. That was a phenomenal presentation. I missed the part you were saying about 3 potential changes that you can make to zoning ordinances. And you talked about eliminating single family only housing areas, zones, embracing attached dwelling units and housing. But the third bullet I didn't catch, which was housing people over cars. We do have a requirement in Hampton that there are a certain number of parking spots depending upon the zone. And that is a function of our, in many ways, it's a safety consideration, and because we have such tight housing stock down at the beach. So I'm curious about what that recommendation is and where you have especially tight summer rental type situations. What do you see other what do you see other people or towns doing rather?
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like this can't, I think it's worth looking at, but it's good to know. Like it may not work in every case. So in a lot of cases where you maybe decrease or get rid of parking minimums is because there's surface parking somewhere else, or kind of using a business that isn't open at night. And so that can be something that's shared. It used to be Centrix Bank in Dover, there was units above it. They relaxed the parking because they were sort of counting that twice and sharing it because the business was closed during the day. And presumably the people that lived above were not really there. Now in COVID, that would have changed everything. So I think it's looking at that and looking at where does existing parking reside already in Hampton. And I know what you mean, having driven down Hampton, I understand about the parking. That's been a big deal. So it may be challenging there, but maybe in other parts of Hampton, it may be something where you can look at relaxing. Yeah.
Okay, well,
Thank you.
George, thank you very much. This was great, and hopefully we can take some action.
Sounds great. Well, I'm only a phone call away. Yep. Happy to be with you, and I'll leave you. Have a great night.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I know that we're getting very close to the witching hour, but I did want to give our 2 state representatives an opportunity to say a few words, give us a quick update on what they've been doing on their vacation. Rennie, would you like to go first?
I'm actually trying to get on vacation, Chris, but I'm failing it because I'm
mute themselves possibly. Some of us can't hear because of the echo.
Hello?
Go ahead, Rennie.
No, I'm actually trying to have vacation. I'm failing it because I'm at my Hampton Democarats meeting. But I just think that for the legislature, many of us are kind of licking our wounds from by any objective standard, kind of a disastrous legislative session in terms of a Democratic agenda for the people of the state of New Hampshire. We're gearing up to deal with 180 retained bills that are in our various committees to try to sort out which are, worthy of supporting, which we want to quickly disappear. And we're also gearing up for the filing period, which opens up, I think, that second week in September for 1 week. Kind of in the background, but certainly about ready to heat up is the whole question of redistricting. The middle of the month, the census numbers come out. The end of September, the more refined data comes out, and you can expect for the next 6 months there to be a lot of contention about what our representative, Senate, executive council, and congressional districts look like that we're focused on. And just one other thing, I did get some good news for people who may have been following it. Our Speaker of the House thinks that he's above the Americans with Disabilities Act. And last Friday, the Democrats sued the Speaker to ensure that there could be remote participation in legislative session by our valuable members. And on Friday, the United States Department of Justice just joined in our lawsuit on our side, filed an appearance saying that in defense of the Americans with Disabilities Act, taking on the Speaker. So we'll have a scene in early September of the Attorney General of the United States squaring off with the Attorney General of the state of New Hampshire over the issue of whether or not the New Hampshire House of Representatives is above the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's going to be kind of a a case that will impact everyone with disability in this country. Done.
Wow, that's great, Rennie. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Mike, how about you?
Yeah, Rennie, mentioned a lot of the things. I was checking them off as we were going. That I was gonna say, relative to the lawsuit, it's gonna be interested in when we get ready to go back in, under what conditions we're gonna be expected to go in. Are we gonna be sitting elbow to elbow with a lot of these individuals who have different beliefs than we have as far as medical things? There's a possibility of a real clash there. I guess we'll see what happens. But there are some other things that, besides what Rennie mentioned, there's some real exciting things like the oil fund distribution board there that we have the meetings, once a month on, but it's interesting to see who's getting what money for what. But the real one is the Business Finance Authority that, and I just love, money figures so much. It really has been interesting with some of the stuff that they bring up, and you find out where some of the development is going on. So it's been worth it being on that one. You actually find out some stuff you wouldn't have. But there's that kind of stuff going on. A lot of the commissions are not meeting for a couple of months this summer, but they'll be picking up again in September. So besides that, I don't have anything else to add.
All right, great. Okay, I know we're getting up against the clock here, but Minnie Messmer has something that she wants to share with you all.
Yes, thanks. Thanks a lot. What a great meeting. As usual, the Hampton Democrats rock. I just wanted to let everybody know I do serve on the Rules Committee, and if you have things that you're concerned about that you want to make change in the Constitution, any registered Democrat in the state of New Hampshire can do that by August 13th.
This is the Constitution of the New Hampshire Democratic Party, right?
Correct.
Not the Constitution.
Democratic Party Constitution. So everything specified about how voting occurs and who's a member of the state party committees and things like that. That's the kind of things we're talking about. So by August 13th, on the 17th, the Rules Committee will meet and deal with those proposed amendments. And then the midterm convention is November 13th, where the broader convention will vote on any proposed changes that are brought to the convention. So I would encourage anybody, if you have questions, you can reach out to me directly if you like. But there's also several people working on amendments to the Constitution, proposed amendments. So don't feel like you'd be the only one doing that. So encourage everybody to be involved in that. Yeah,
if you are interested in making some changes, as Mindy said, reach out to her. You can reach out to me, and we can put you in contact with some people that are already working on some stuff to make sure that there's no duplication of effort. Okay, Larry, anything from the Rockingham County Dems that you want to share with us?
Thank you, Chris. Great to see all of you. And I second what Mindy said. The Hampton Dems are a great committee, and you're so solid. It's wonderful to visit your meetings. So the clam bake, we've announced it. It's going to be on Friday, September 24th at 6 p.m. We were going to have it at the usual place, the Elks Club in Portsmouth, but with this Delta variant and the pandemic going the wrong direction, we decided it just wasn't safe. So it'll be on Zoom. Rennie will be speaking. We have our entire congressional delegation, Cindy Warmington, Donna Susi, Kate Coyle, and our keynote speaker will be Colin Allred, congressman from Texas. He played 5 years in the NFL. He's a strong advocate for voting rights. So voting rights in Texas, he's in the thick of the battle. So I put in earlier in the chat the link. So the tickets are $25. I hope everybody will buy one. This is our big fundraiser for the year. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, thank you. Anything from anybody else? Seeing nobody raising their hand, I will let you all get back to the Olympics.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Chris.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much. Thank
Thanks.
you, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
thanks to Team Hampton, the
Yep.
best.
Bye-bye.
Al.